Hi there, and welcome back to SciBurst, a podcast all about science, popular culture, and entertainment. We are your hosts, Ella
and Isabel, two science communicators and sci-fi nerds steering this spaceship into the multiverse of science fun. Today's episode, organs and xenotransplantation in fiction and reality.
And as always, we are going to start by jumping into some recommendations. And before that, it is really important that we acknowledge that this episode of SciBurst is being recorded on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Indigenous Australians are the first scientists and artists, and we would like to pay our respects to elders past, present, emerging, and future. So Isabel, culture snap time. What delight have you got to share with us today?
Yeah, so on theme today, I want to talk about the Organ Attack card game. Have you played this card game?
I have not, but I'd love to hear more because I'm a big card game fan.
It's hilarious. It's a medical themed card game created by a cartoonist.
Okay.
Who he has like webtoons and things, and there's one which is like a brain and a heart, and then I think he eventually developed into a like organ card game. So basically you're dealt a set of organs as cards, and then you also have additional cards which are like immunity, affliction, and other cards to protect yourself, and then also cards to inflict disease and bodily harm on your opponents.
Whoa.
It's pretty brutal. So the last person to still have at least one organ is the winner.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I would love to have more than one organ, but I can see how having at least one would mean that you were winning.
My brain's still there.
Good.
And it's funny because it's some quite gory, like dark themes.
Like some of what we're touching on this episode.
Yeah, but then the art is quite cutesy.
Oh, so you got that juxtaposition going on.
Yeah. But yeah, I highly recommend. Anyway, what's your culture snap, Ella?
Mine is I thought I'd go back into a little bit of my ag roots as I used to raise sheep. And my recommendation, my culture snap, is to buy woolen. Woolen blankets, woolen clothing. In the Southern Hemisphere, we are approaching the colder months.
Yes.
And it's getting a bit chilly. If you have the means to, you're looking to get like a new winter coat or like a blanket, highly recommend buying woolen, supporting the Australian sheep industry. Woolen material, it's like fire retardant, it's pretty environmentally friendly, it's warm, it's breathable, it's insulating. And also we're going to be talking, kind of like I said a few seconds ago, about some darker themes kind of to do with animals in this episode.
Yeah.
I just think it'd be nice to support your local animal industry, considering what we're about to talk about. So there is a connection there. It will become, I think, more obvious as we go on.
Yeah. So I don't know if Ella's shared this on the podcast before, but she loves sheep.
Yeah, absolutely love them. I used to raise sheep. I did it for, I think, over 10 years. I was big into kind of like junior agriculture and the sheep showing and junior sheep judging, kind of like circles. Corriedales are my favorite breed. So, yeah, give me your sheep breed favorites in the comments below.
That's so niche.
Please, someone out there have some opinions on sheep breeds that would warm my little heart.
Anyway, so before we get into today's topic, I think we need a content warning for this episode.
Baby's first content warning?
Yeah, because it's about to get a bit gory.
Yeah.
There are going to be some graphic descriptions and also discussions of animal cruelty. So if any of that is going to trigger you or make you feel uncomfortable, we advise maybe skipping this episode.
Yeah, go back and listen to the episode on magic trees.
Yes.
It's like a warm hug.
That's the one for you.
Very wholesome. This one delving into animals, xenotransplantation, a bit of medical science, and organ transplantation. So, it's gonna be a fun journey and a fun discussion. But if that's not for you, that's fully okay.
So speaking of organ transplantation,
Yeah.
we have thrown around the term xenotransplantation a few times.
I feel like I had no idea what that was before we started researching.
Yeah. Well, we knew what it was. We just didn't know what the word was for it.
So true.
Right? So xenotransplantation, or sometimes it's called cross-species transplantation or heterotransplantation. It's the transplantation of living cells, tissues, or organs from one species to another, usually from non-human animals to humans.
Yeah.
So the first serious attempts appeared in scientific literature around beginning of early 1900s.
So for like early medical science.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
When parts of a rabbit kidney were transplanted into a child with chronic kidney disease.
Whoa.
Yeah. I know, that's quite a lot. And thinking back to the time as well, you think, that's
spicy. Like, I don't know how sterilized their equipment
well, exactly.
was, you know?
Well, exactly, yeah. So reportedly, the immediate results were excellent.
Okay.
But ultimately, the child died not long after of pulmonary congestion, which is too much fluid in the lungs.
Like, I don't know if the rabbit kidney didn't help, but I can't imagine it would help, you know? Like, I don't know how much that contributed to the lungs, but I don't think it was, like, helping the body.
Yeah. So for a period of time, it was quite big, around, like, early 1900s.
Yeah.
But then scientific interest in xenotransplantation rapidly decreased when the process of organ rejection was described.
So when we began to understand organ transplantation better, we were like, maybe not animals.
Yeah, exactly. So organ rejection is basically when your immune system treats the new organ like a foreign object and attacks it.
Yeah.
Just not what we want.
So if it sees it, it's like, that's not part of me, no thank you. The body attacks it like it would any bacteria or infection or virus.
Mm-hmm. However,
Ooh.
there's renewed interest in it because of organ donation shortages. A lot of the time, the demand for human organs for clinical transplantation far exceeds the supply. And this was actually quite a big problem during COVID as well, in the pandemic. However, there are serious ethical and practical concerns surrounding it, which are also explored a lot in fictional contexts.
Yeah, it is explored so much in fictional context. And I don't know, it's funny, interesting, weird. We found this whole list and Wikipedia article on organ transplantation in fiction.
Yeah.
So not just it happening in real life, but specifically in fiction. There's this whole kind of like bodies of work and collections of bodies of work dedicated to it. It is a really common theme in science fiction and horror fiction. I think both for obvious reasons. Science fiction, it being themed in because we're trying to push boundaries. We're looking at what could the possibilities of the future hold when our technology gets better, imagining that kind of reality. And I think horror fiction is really obvious too, because xenotransplantation, it has gone wrong before. Yeah. And also there is such a big taboo about it. Yeah. Understandably. But horror fiction, as is kind of well known, is a really great place to explore human taboos. Yeah. In a safe place, because you turn it into something horrifying and scary, but that gives you a venue to discuss and view it.
Completely. I think that's partly why I enjoy horror text so much too, because it touches on taboo topics. Yeah. Like, it's not just the thrill that you get out of watching a horror movie, but it's also that aspect.
It's also like topics that no one else will poke with a stick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of, so organ transplants kind of in these two fictional worlds are split into two different types. Not necessarily animal and human, but in donors that are willing, so individuals who want to maybe dedicate and donate their own life-critical organs, such as brain or heart, at the cost of their own life, maybe because they believe in this medical creation they're making for better, or in the case of like horror science fiction, for worse. So yeah, the willing organ donation, and then it's also split into organ transplant from donors who
Yeah.
are
Okay.
unwilling or incapable of objecting.
Yeah.
This is really common in dystopian fiction, really common in kind of like a blend of sci-fi and horror, and definitely very common in horror fiction.
Well, sci-fi is usually has lots of elements of horror in it because they also like to touch on like ethical debates and
Yeah, they're both boundary pushing kind of in their own ways, and I think
so.
it's the way in which they approach pushing boundaries that separates a bit of the genres.
Totally. And even before organ transplantation became a reality, it was already being portrayed in films and books as a Frankenstein type
So like
endeavor.
before we even did it in humans.
Yeah. And according to literary research, early portrayals of transplantation in pop culture were typified in three main ways. So like these are the sorts of tropes that you get in fiction that explores this. It's the transplantation of gross anatomy, so particularly brains, heads, limbs, the concept of the rebellious body, and also the role of the mad scientist.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to see those, I think, quite a lot
Yep.
in this episode. That's really interesting. And something I think we'll just touch on now is that there is a lot of fiction and movies in particular that touch on human-like features in animals.
Yeah.
Such as like Charlotte's Web, the Shaggy Dog, et cetera, et cetera. We're not really going to be touching on those during this episode. We're kind of going to focus mostly on organ transplants and xenotransplantation. But that is like a whole other genre that exists. But that kind of goes away from the horror genre into more like family-friendly children's themes.
But it's still important to note those portrayals because sometimes there is overlap between the two.
Yeah, and also talk about like how prolific this is. It's something we're interested in as a species. So it's important to discuss, and yeah, I'm super excited. First time we're discussing medical science in an episode.
Yes.
So super keen for that.
It is. And I think if this is the first time discussing medicine, this is the first time we've hit all elements of STEM.
Let's go.
Go us. And also our 10th episode.
Oh my gosh, it's all coming together.
Yeah. So let's start talking about fiction and human-like features in animals.
Let's dive into it.
I wanted to start with Planet of the Apes. So in the 1968 film, non-human primates have evolved human-like abilities, running the earth with little regard for human life.
I hate that that's a human-like ability.
Well, because it's like trying to reflect us, like reflect back on us, yeah. And humans have lost the power of verbal communication and live much like how apes currently do. So there's no xenotransplantation or organ transplantation in the story that I know of. Please correct me if I'm wrong, because there's a lot of adaptations of the story, so there could be something in there somewhere. Yeah. But I would argue that it's exploring adjacent themes and concerns, which is why I think it's a good one to start with. So in 2021, scientists created the first human monkey life form by injecting human stem cells into a monkey embryo.
Oh, I remember this.
Yes.
Super controversial.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this part human life form is called a chimera, and if you implant it into a monkey uterus, could theoretically, and I use that word very carefully, develop into a live-born animal that has both monkey and human cells. So we've used similar processes to create animals like the geep, which is the goat-sheep combination.
I see that word and my head just goes Jeep.
Yeah, I know. But the technique has not been used in humans. Thank goodness. So this experiment has sparked discussions that humans could one day receive organ replacements from human monkey chimeras or human pig chimeras, but of course not without worries of cementing structural injustice against non-human animals. And the reason I've mentioned all of this, because in the media, the research has been likened to Planet of the Apes, and people being like, oh, is Planet of the Apes becoming a reality?
Yeah, it's kind of used as that like anchoring thought, I guess.
Yes. And sparking fears that xenotransplantation will lead to people becoming animals themselves, and raising the ultimate question of how we should actually be treating other life forms.
Yeah, which so much of this media goes into.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, I don't know, maybe a little segue, maybe cool to touch on, yeah, I guess the processes of combining species, and
Yeah.
just like at a base level, like why it's not a good idea, why it doesn't happen very often.
Mm-hmm.
And this is because all life forms made out of DNA, it is universal but also redundant, because all DNA does is code for proteins, but that somehow makes everything from, like lettuce to humans to ants.
Mm-hmm.
When you're combining two different species, often the distinction between like what makes something a species is that it cannot interbreed with something else.
Yeah.
So like goats and sheep are distinct because they cannot breed and create offspring that can then produce more of that combination. And this is because the genetic information that they each carry doesn't quite line up with each other.
Yeah.
So something viable doesn't happen as an end product. And like the viable in this scenario would be like a geep that can, mate and reproduce with another geep, creating little geep children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think those species, animals like a geep, are often infertile. Anyway, like that's just a result of creating a creature in that way. Yeah. That I don't think, I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's one of the effects.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. So that's why kind of like at a base level, humans are not monkeys because we cannot interbreed. Therefore, if you made a combination of both, there are a whole bunch of unstable genetic factors, even if it was
effects
successful.
Yeah.
So even if, what could sustain being alive, just as like, I don't know how much other people know about genetics. This is, I did a whole, major in biological anthropology, a lot of discussions about what distinguishes one species of early humans from another, or early hominins and such like. So, just leaving that there before we go on and talk about some more, fictional depictions of xenotransplantation.
And texts that perhaps inspired the one I just talked about.
Yeah. So, H.G. Wells, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and it's kind of more contemporary re-envisaging by Anne Harlem called Dr. Franklin's Islands. These are stories where I think they're all teenagers end up on an island where there is kind of that crazy mad scientist image.
There you go. There's the trope.
Who, use genetic engineering and experimentation and vivisection, which is viva, live, section, cutting. So cutting things together that are already living.
Yeah.
To create human animal creatures, beasts, etc. And this did inspire Planet of the Apes, the original H.G. Wells story. That's from 1896. So has existed for quite a while. And is kind of really, really at the center of a lot of these works. That's kind of one of the first works of fiction that created this motif called uplift, in which a more advanced race, normally humans, intervenes with the evolution of an animal species.
Oh, okay.
To bring them to a higher level of intelligence as classified by that species who thinks they're more intelligent.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of the main themes we get from that work, and it's it's all its adaptations and flow and effects in media and in science fiction. In the more contemporary version, there's this island. Dr. Franklin replaces the character of Dr. Moreau. Some teenagers are taken onto an island and transgenic experiments are performed on them.
Oh, we love that.
Love them. It transforms one of them into a bird and one of them into a manta ray.
Why?
And they can communicate through radio chips planted in their bodies. The story ends with like them being given an antidote that reverts them back to their human selves, but them having the DNA in their cells apparently that might have cues that return, bring them back to these animals.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of dives into a whole bunch of themes around barriers between different animals, barriers between humans and animals.
Yeah. And so were like they operated on to get them to that stage?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the scientists kind of took them, did a whole bunch of what-os. A lot of, especially the H.G. Wells original version, focuses on the pain element of that, diving a lot into the horror genre aspects.
So it's quite a graphic read, like difficult read.
Yeah, I've heard. In Island of Dr. Moreau, they use blood transfusion, extensive surgery, and also hypnotism.
Oh.
To alter these people into animals known as bestial monsters, mere grotesque travesties of men.
I love it when they refer to non-human animals as beasts and travesties of beings.
Yeah, it really makes me think, that they care a lot for the animals that are involved in these experiments. There's a quote from Dr. Franklin's Island from a character that says, "My friends and their friends used to use his name as an example of a mad scientist. Science gone bad." And I was reading this work that says Franklin's experiments indicate a complete disregard for life, any life, whether human, animal, or human animal. And his lack of hesitation not only to experiment on human animals, but also to sacrifice them at the end of the experiment complicates an interpretation of Franklin as solely speciesist and anthropocentric. So he was dreaming of enabling human animals to explore the lives of others as other. He wanted to continue to explore, if you create the in-group of humans, like the super intelligent, we love humans, if you combine them with animals, can you continue to other humans? Can you make humans lesser by tossing them in with animals who he doesn't have any regard for?
Wow. So Franklin is the character
in the more modern one.
Okay, yeah. I was just thinking, I think it's inspired by Dr. Frankenstein, and it's just another take on, because Frankenstein.
Yeah, I imagine it's probably how it comes from a lot of reading of really, really similar texts. Yeah, some crazy themes there. And I had never heard of, I guess, Dr. Franklin's Islands and the impact of the island of Dr. Moreau before researching for this podcast.
I'd heard of it before, but I wasn't really aware of what it was about. Like, it was one of those texts that had been mentioned here and there.
It seems like a lot, and I'm kind of happy
it is a lot.
I didn't fully, read it. And I just get to experience it through these academic works because there's like a layer of distinction. I'm not really cool with the whole pain for the sake of pain for science. One fictional work that we both have read though is Oryx and Crake.
Yeah.
By the stunning feminist queen that is Margret.
I adore Margret Atwood. One of my favorite authors.
She's amazing and she's so quick-witted and on it, and her books are written in such a modern way with fast pacing that is still literary but easy to read. Like, it's highbrow but not at the cost of making it difficult for you to trudge through. Her work Oryx and Crake is so impossible to summarize.
Well, because a lot of it is stream of consciousness. Like, the character is just sort of living. He's living. You're experiencing the story from the older character reflecting back on his boyhood. Yeah, there's lots of flashbacks, and it can get a bit like, when is it current and when is it past.
You don't really know who he is in his own story because they're like code names and all the rest of it. For what we're talking about, we're going to kind of talk about the boyhood section because of what that brings up in the world of organ transplantation and xenotransplantation. So the narrative, as we said, kind of begins with Jimmy or Snowman's boyhood, his childhood. Yeah. And this character's parents work at a company called Organ Inc. So like organic but organs incorporated farms, organic farms. Yeah. And this place researches different ways to grow human organs cheaply and effectively. Jimmy's mum is increasingly disgusted by the work that happens here, as we find out as the book goes on. And she suffers from this, and she eventually runs away, abandoning Jimmy because of this. So you got to imagine like the things that are going down here. And Jimmy, the character, imagines things that are going down in this, research institute in this incorporated organ farm kind of place that, it might not be ethical or with, the most morality involved for someone who's working in it to run away and abandon their whole life. So what do they do in this place? Well, they created pigoons, which are intelligent pig organ non-donors. So the goal of the Pigoon project, says Atwood, is to grow an assortment of foolproof human tissue organs in a transgenic knockout pig host, organs that would transplant smoothly and avoid rejections. So this comes into kind of what Isabel was discussing before. Yeah. We're trying to avoid rejections, as that's a well-known kind of the medical field that is. So these pigoons are used to grow organs for wealthy people who need them for as long as the animals can be kept alive. So they keep the animal alive, harvest all the organs until the animal can't live anymore.
Right. So this is something that specifically wealthy people can access.
Yes, it is inaccessible. And the wealthier you are, it's kind of like based on intelligence, based on how much you can help the society in this book. And when the pigoons cannot be kept alive, they're discarded for purposes unknown. And everyone in this book, everyone in this world, really does not want to eat pigoon meat, because what if there are human cells in there? Oh. Because what if, what makes them compatible with humans isn't really transparent. Yeah. Everyone is pretty sure that most of the pork they buy is secretly pigoon anyway.
Wonderful.
A Vox article calls the pigoon the creepiest manifestation of hubris in the book. There's also, as kind of like another species of human, animal, plant, transplantation, creation, are these crakers. And they are terrifying. And, kind of ultimately we're in a society that's creating these weird, messed up, alienating species. And ultimately the system in this book series does backfire.
Yeah. I mean, basically the book is humanity having an existential crisis, right? Yeah. In several, manifested in several different ways. It just sort of explodes.
Yeah. A bit of a spoiler for the end of the book. So if you don't want to know about the end of it, don't listen for about the next minute. But ultimately, at the end, this backfires, these creations. And the human race in the book is decimated by a biological weapon. The pigoons become some of the most dangerous predators. And they run and hunt down lone human survivors and eat them. The book quotes this as a brainy and omnivorous animal, the pigoon. And that's, kind of one of the last thoughts you get. Woo, crazy. There's this other quote from Oryx and Crake that I wanted to talk through. And this is from really early on in the book. And you'll see, if you've joined back in, the spoiler is over. For those who stopped listening to the spoiler. Isabel just looked at me like, what is happening?
Yeah, I forgot that was a spoiler we just talked about.
So this is from the start of the book. if you listen to the spoiler, you'll understand how it relates to the end. So this is from Crake, who says, Jimmy, look at it realistically. You can't couple a minimum access to food with an expanding population indefinitely. Homo sapiens doesn't seem to be able to cut himself off at the supply end. He's one of the few species that doesn't limit reproduction in face of dwindling resources. In other words, and up to a point, of course, the less we eat, the more we procreate. I don't swear.
Well, this is also a clean podcast, so we can't use that word. I would have had to bleep it out, but it was the bad word,
the F-bomb. And then Jimmy says, how do you account for that? And Crake says, imagination. Men can imagine their own deaths. Human beings hope they can stick their souls into someone else and live on forever.
God, Crake is such a dark character.
Crake is crazy.
Yeah. Has problems.
Has lots of problems. You will see why if and when you read the book. So these science fiction creations in Oryx and Crake, they do reflect the current reality of current animal research. Xenotransplantation research on pigs and baboons. Baboons are part of the Crakers, other species that I touched on. So under supervision of the US FDA and New Harvest, which is a kind of an organization not dissimilar from Organ Inc., there is continued research on development of meat substitutes from stem cells of pigs into edible protein sources. So the pig doesn't have to necessarily die for humans to get a use from it. And this is what we see with the pigoons in Oryx and Crake. So that was a lot on those three fictional worlds.
Yeah.
Some of it quite damning. But it might be cool now. I guess we kind of like went old with H.G. Wells, back with Dr. Franklin, and then still pretty modern with Margret Atwood. I'd love to go back to Frankenstein.
Yeah. So Frankenstein, super early science fiction text from Western literature, written by Queen Mary Shelley, who I also love and adore. So in the novel, the scientist Victor Frankenstein doesn't actually reveal much about how he makes the creature. And so there are many interpretations of how it was done. And I mean, the reason why he doesn't reveal much is because he doesn't want anybody else to do it because of what happened
to him.
Yeah, what happened afterwards. So one of the interpretations is through organ transplantation. Because it's implied in a few places that he uses a combination of human and animal parts to make it. And one quote from the book says that he tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay. That's pretty horrible.
Yeah, that's pretty not nice.
Yeah, and also Shelley herself describes a monster in the introduction of the book as component parts brought together and endued with vital warmth, i.e. a transplanted body.
It does sound like there would have had to be organ transplants to make that happen.
Yeah, so I think in some form she's implied that there's xenotransplantation at some point, whether that was like the whole body or if it was just parts or whatever it is. Also, some argue that Frankenstein was the first sci-fi novel to rely purely upon human intervention to create life. And while the actual scientific process is unclear, there's actually no supernatural agency involved, which is fascinating.
It is fascinating, and I think Frankenstein is often brought up under the same umbrella as Dracula, which is supernatural and distinct from science fiction. Because of that. Not to say you can't have like blendings of science fiction and fantasy or supernatural elements, but that this is like, the beginning of science fiction is pure.
Yeah. Oh, well, a lot of people argue, and I agree with them, that Frankenstein is the first science fiction novel in Western culture, period.
It feels like it started it.
Yeah. Also, I think it's much better than Dracula, and you can find me if you disagree. It is. Like, I think it's exploring some really interesting themes that are way more innovative.
Yeah, I wonder if there have been more Frankenstein or Dracula interpretations. Because I feel like Dracula as a character lives on more than the story of Dracula, whereas I think the story of Frankenstein
Oh, I see what you mean.
lives on maybe equally to the character
Mm-hmm.
of Frankenstein's monster.
Well, we have this interesting thing in pop culture too, where Frankenstein, the monster, is referred to as Frankenstein.
Yeah,
Like the
it's
green guy,
shorthand.
the green guy with bolts in his head. That's the monster. That's not Frankenstein. Even though Frankenstein is a monster himself in other ways.
Metaphorical monster.
Yeah.
But aren't all monsters metaphorical monsters? Speaking of monsters, I like transition to talking about Eva by Peter Dickinson.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of this one until you mentioned it earlier.
Me either. It's from... Oh, I found it in a journal entry about when science blurs the boundaries about the commodification of animals.
Okay.
So it's supposed to be futuristic, this novel. And essentially, the plot, the premise is that this teenager, again, teenagers, which I think is interesting and relevant.
Yeah.
Eva Adamson wakes up from an apparent irreversible coma that has resulted from a horrific car accident. And then throughout the starting pages, it is revealed that Eva has become the subject of an experimental brain transplant between humans and animals, which is kind of like a neuron memory procedure that is supposed to recreate the pattern of your memories into a different brain.
Okay.
So this pattern is supposed to be like your personality, and it's different from any other pattern that ever was or will be. So Eva wakes up from this coma, from this car accident, in the body of a chimpanzee who used to be known as Kelly. The interesting themes that this story, I guess, explores is that Eva's parents and the professor and the scientist who are all responsible for the procedure and the choices, these adults, they never appear to struggle with the moral or ethical dilemmas
What the heck?
in their use of condemning this chimpanzee Kelly to carry Eva's memories.
So they're just okay with it.
They're just okay with it. And most of the questioning comes from the authorial voice to the reader and also from Eva, the character, conversing with Kelly. So Eva's father is a zoologist.
Oh my gosh.
And he justifies his choice by saying, "Of course, we have a moral responsibility to all living things. As a zoologist, life is my trade, so I feel this more strongly than most." Cough, cough, what? I feel it especially towards chimpanzees. Still, it is different from the responsibility we have toward any single human being.
And that came from a zoologist.
Yeah. So we really see this kind of like prioritization of human life way, way over any animals, including from the specialists in this world who, you know, are supposed to care about, study about animals and chimpanzees in particular. And it is revealed later on that Kelly, who used to live in this furry skin, where is she now? Eva becomes cognizant that there is a divide between the physical Kelly, the psychological Eva, and the psychological Kelly who is buried.
Oh, I don't like that. This is reminding me of a horror movie I recently watched, which, I can't mention it because it's going to spoil it.
Okay.
It was a Jordan Peele one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the questions that come from this story are, what is lost and gained from human animal transplants and organ transplants? So it's kind of like less than a transplant, more of like an organ redesigned to be like one that could have been transplanted. I don't know if that makes sense. It's also bringing up a lot of themes about the blend between human and animals.
Yeah.
And this question I have after reading this and knowing about the story is, does this work bring us closer to animals? Because I would argue yes for the individual, but for the people who made the choice, I think it separates humans and animals further. But
Because of the ethics?
Because of the ethics.
Yeah,
but the person who's living it, she is closer.
Oh, it's so like warped when you think about it.
It's so icky, and it comes down to this theme that is touched on in lots of essays on this area. There's 3 kind of that I've drawn most of these examples from that we'll put in our resources out later. that talk about animals as significant, and their main value in these fictional worlds is by their quote-unquote use value.
For humans.
It's not the use value for animals or other animals, like chimpanzee transplant to another chimpanzee. Doesn't matter. It's not a use value. It's what can they do for us. So can they provide us food? Can they provide us organs? Can they provide my teenage daughter a skin suit to put her brain memory in? And that is the value of their life. Their life is only important as it provides for us.
Ooh.
Crazy.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so we're getting into some pretty deep, dank and dark places.
Yeah, I'm actually interested to read this now though.
Yeah?
Like, it's messed up, but I think it's touching on some important and interesting themes.
Hold that thought, because I wasn't going to include this one.
Oh.
And then I started reading more and I've put it in.
Oh.
This is a 1988 story, Bruce McAllister's The Girl Who Loved Animals.
Okay.
So just think about animals significant by their use value.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to kind of flip that a little bit.
Oh.
So this story tells the journey of Lizzie Toma, who's a 20-year-old woman, who's from a broken home. She gets given a vulnerability rating of a whooping 9.6 out of 10. So she's a vulnerable person.
Oh, so they have vulnerability ratings in this
She gets...
world?
Yeah, she gets a social worker assigned to her.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Who rates her vulnerability, knows that her IQ is 84, which is not like, it's not genius levels, is what this book is saying.
Yeah.
So the book is questioning her choices. She's been assigned a social worker because of this, and it's from the perspective of the social worker. So that Lizzie Toma, this 20-year-old woman, she accepts a contract to become a surrogate mother of a gorilla fetus.
Why?
To increase the population of the endangered species.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So Lizzie has an abusive boyfriend, discovers his pregnancy, eats her, and it's all about the ethical implications of should the social worker let this human who has not had a great life, apparently isn't intelligent enough, to make her own decisions, to carry a gorilla fetus to term inside of her. So we're now looking at animals' use value almost at the opposite way of like a human use value. So the human is providing the value to this endangered species because other humans have said it's worth it. And it's essentially the social worker struggling with the choices because she has a significant say over Lizzie's life. In contrast to this, we go into more speculative fiction, science fiction elements of the social worker's own daughter is addicted to virtual reality of this thing called walljacking. And this daughter spends time plugged into a machine that stimulates, quote unquote, the right places in your skull. And basically the system becomes so involved in Joe's, the social cases worker's daughter's head that it cannot be disconnected without causing death.
It's getting a bit cybernetic there.
It is. So we kind of end up with these thoughts of like, is it less human to be attached to a machine than it is to have a non-human growing inside of you? And that's kind of the line that Joe struggles with, and I think touches on a lot of these story elements in a nicer, more morally, I don't know.
Still kind of weird, but
but like the morality and ethics, I think in this are more aligned with us as readers, as an audience, than the other ones are. This isn't to say like it happened without consent. Like everything in here is with consent. It's not one of those stories of organ transplantations like the islands and you know, Frankenstein's monster couldn't consent, wasn't alive. But this is all happening with knowledge, so it's kind of like a nicer discussion. Like I would be most open, I think, to reading this full text than any others, other than Frankenstein, because it's that work, you know. But I think it brings up a really interesting question of when is too far, and when is, I don't know, not one situation worse than the other, but when a situation's equivalent, and what do you get to care about more? Like, should you be more outraged at someone choosing to raise a gorilla, or more outraged at someone, maybe throwing their life away living in a virtual world? So I thought, I don't know, there's a lot there to think about.
There is.
And I think because of that, it's the most interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, and it's also like our relationship with animals and nature versus our relationship with technology, and comparing like the two.
Well, it's also, I think, our relationship with animals versus our relationship with ourselves.
That as well, yeah.
And kind of which one makes you less human? Is it interacting with nature or interacting with technology?
Mm-hmm.
Super cool, and, is down to not only organ transplantation of like transplanting something inside an organ, the uterus, to carry the pregnancy to term, but also like all the organs that will grow within that gorilla fetus.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought kind of on that more positive end, I'd love to throw to you, Isabel, for one of the reasons why we started this episode as an idea in the first place.
I want to talk about the sci-fi novel Pig Heart Boy, which is, I think, from the 90s by author Mallory Blackman. And it explores, it's actually a children's book, interestingly, because she's a children's author. And it explores xenotransplantation through the eyes of a 13-year-old boy, Cameron, who has a bad heart. So in the story, Cameron is a long way down the waiting list for a heart transplant and is unlikely to reach his 14th birthday without a transplant. And so when a genetically modified pig's heart is offered by a pioneering doctor, he decides to go for it, and his new heart completely changes his life in unexpected ways. I don't know many details about how, because I haven't read the book. I am interested to read the book now, though. And yeah, like I said, the author is a children's author and intentionally wrote the story for children, using the book as a vehicle for starting discussions about STEM and self-reflection in children. And she wrote a Guardian article about the book and also a recent pig heart transplantation.
Yeah.
And I wanted to read this quote from the article. So she says, "Now some people might think that the subject matter is not suitable for children. I completely disagree. As a children's author, it never ceases to amaze me how some adults underestimate what subject matter will interest and stimulate children and teens. I wanted to write a story that provided no right or wrong answers, but which would provide food for thought and discussion. A story that would allow the reader to walk in Cameron's shoes for a while and think about what decisions they would make and how they would react if they too were faced with his dilemma. I believe the best stories encourage children to think for themselves." And then here's the best part. Fictional stories that explore new ideas when it comes to STEM subjects also have a part to play in enriching our children's reading and learning. Pig Heart Boy was my attempt to incorporate science possible into a believable, thought-provoking story.
Stunning.
Yeah. So she's touched on a difficult STEM subject, and in a way that's also trying to start discussions around the ethics related to it, and for children, so children can also have those reflections and discussions
and form their own opinion, because it's coming from a book that's not trying to push
exactly
one way or the other. So the recent one she's talking about was a surgery that happened in 2022, which was the first pig heart transplant given to a 57-year-old man.
Yeah.
In America. And this was really interesting because the surgeons used a heart from a gene-edited pig. And scientists modified the animal to remove pig genes that trigger the super fast rejection of not human, not mine. The body revolts against
Got
it. So they added human genes to the heart, to the pig, to help the body accept the organ. And this worked for 2 months. And unfortunately, the patient didn't make it past the 2-month section, but it got past the initial rejection period, which is really interesting. And his family are really grateful for every innovative moment that allowed their, this person to survive for an extra 2 months with this pig organ transplant. So we have an example of it so close to working really recently. This is last year. Yeah, so just over 12 months ago. So all these things we've discussed, that book, it's all so relevant. It's all still happening. And that is super exciting. And I think a really positive moment to end on. In addition to that, I wanted to also end on this quote from Oryx and Crake, one of the main pieces of work that we both drifted to with this subject. That is, after everything that's happened, how can the world still be so beautiful? Because it is. And I think that's lovely. I cannot believe we turned this horror sci-fi melt around into...
I didn't think we could do it.
Look at us go. Something positive, something heartwarming, looking to the future.
Yeah.
Wow.
There you go. Organs, transplants.
We've done it all. Medical, science, the M in STEM. Or one of the M's in STEM, I guess. Mathematics too. Yeah. Which we touched on.
Well, medicine is like the invisible M in STEM.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes people write it with 2 M's.
Yeah, that's true. Mathematics, yes, we touched on a bit in our Everything Everywhere All at Once multiverse episode. But it's great to talk about medical science because I think it's so visible and it's often that really big thing of human interest. And I think we forget that it's connected to popular culture a lot of the time too.
I think it's time to jump into our individual sections.
Let's do it.
So, Ella, please tell me about transplants in X-Men.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about, we've spoken a little bit about brain transplants. We had that weird chimpanzee brain human story. I want to talk about the idea of cerebro in X-Men. And cerebro comes from Spanish for brain, the Latin from cerebrum, the brain. This is a fictional technological device that appears in the X-Men comics. It is used by the X-Men, in particular my boy, Charles Xavier, Professor X, we stan. He's a super interesting character, I guess, if we go back to themes of this episode in terms of morality and ethics and his position on doing what is right. And that is at the center of a lot of the conflict between him and Eric Lenscher or Magneto. That's kind of the ethics and the justifications of how to get to an endpoint is where they bump against each other. But yeah, Professor X uses cerebro to detect humans, specifically mutants, by attaching, in X-Men First Class, it's depicted kind of like as this helmet, attaches this helmet over his brain. It links into his cerebral cortex and uses his super genetic mutation powers to try and find other mutants so they can track them down and provide like a safe space for them or add them to their team or, a whole number of things depending on which version of the adaptation you're looking at. In X-Men First Class, it is this really cool piece of tech that is, kind of old-fashioned. It lights up a little bit. Eric tells Charles he looks like an adorable lab rat wearing this because they don't know if it's going to work. And I think this is another example of not quite a organ transplant, but it is a willing person having modifications or technological uses of their organs.
Yeah, consent is very important.
Consent is very important, and I think that's a lot of the time what differs between like an adventure story to a horror story. Yeah, so I thought that was a really relevant one to touch on. I didn't want to go into, there's like all sorts of things with like Wolverine of like bodily torture. Let's not go there. Let's leave it at the nicer ones.
You can save that for our horror episode.
Talking about exciting things, Isabel, I hear you have an alternative to Xenotransplantation to talk about.
Yeah, I wanted to end by talking about an emerging alternative to Xenotransplantation that is quite exciting and a lot more ethical.
We love.
And that is organoids. So organoids are miniature, simplified organs grown in the lab from stem cells. They are 3D tissue-like structures about 1/1,000,000th the size of an adult human organ.
That is so small.
And in their tiny, tiny forms, they mimic many functions of their life-size equivalents. For example, a heart organoid pumps about 60 times a minute.
And it's 1 millionth of the size.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Just like a tiny, tiny pulsing little boy.
That's so cute.
So the ultimate goal of organoid research is to grow working organs for transplant, or at least parts. They could also signal the end of animal testing for medicine, because they can imitate the human body for clinical trials. So you can just skip the animal phase completely and use organoids instead. And have the potential for personalized treatment, which I think is the future of medicine and
personalized treatment
excites me very much. And how this works is organoids can take tissue directly from a patient, and they're like unique structures, which means the organoids contain DNA of the patient and thus carry personal characteristics of the patient. And that means for transplantation, they're more likely to be accepted by the body than an animal organ because it's parts of you, effectively.
Yes, they'll carry the marker that your cells have to carry to say, like, hey, this is me, don't hurt me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, cool.
And then, of course, for medicine more generally, this lets us tailor for differing effects of diseases and conditions on different age groups, sexes, genetic makeups.
Love.
And of course, organoids are not simple to develop. It's very hard to make a tiny organ.
Like, it makes sense, but it's very sad to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Organs are complex, self-organized systems that have evolved over hundreds of millions of years. Hence, it is difficult. But we're making progress fast. In July of last year, 2022.
Wow, so relevant.
Researchers in Japan succeeded in the world's first in-human clinical transplantation of an organoid.
Whoa.
And the organoid was transplanted into the colon of a patient with ulcerative colitis using a colonoscopy. And get this, the patient was discharged the following day, everybody.
I mean, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, I don't know like what the follow-up to that was. Like, I would hope they're still fine, but I haven't read any articles since then. So,
I mean, to be discharged the following day, you'd presume they're in pretty good health.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
Super exciting.
Yeah, wow. What an episode. I'd love to hear from our audience, from you, dear listeners. What other forms of organ transplantation have you come across in popular culture? Yeah, what have you seen? What have you read? What have you heard?
And how do they compare to real world transplantation and ethical debates currently?
Yeah, because there's a lot happening, and I'm sure as this episode grows older, there'll be more and more happening too that people can connect to. Also, would you participate in xenotransplantation? I don't know. I think it depends what.
Yeah.
But yeah, you should let us know via our socials. Hit us up at Cyburst, Cy_burst, on all your favorite social medias. Stay nerdy, and we will see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you to ANU CPAS for their support and access to their podcast studio.